Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics teaches a practice of moderation. As far as Aristotle is concerned, what ethics is all about is acquiring the right habits in accord with our appetites and urges. We should not go to the extreme, either too great or too little. Here's an example you may not have thought of: generosity. Most of us, if not all, have the urge to help others out from time to time, to be giving of our money and our time. Aristotle says, well, that's okay, that's a good thing, but you can give too much. And he, of course, is thinking of the tradition in Athens of being asked to sponsor a festival. And he says, well, now you could give so much that you have no food left for yourself or your family, and you wind up on the street after the festival. Contrary-wise, you could be so stingy in giving out money to support the festival that nothing really good happens at the festival, and you look a fool and a cad. It is that middle course, giving the right amount, doing just the right thing, that is appropriate. The story goes, if someone was charged with being stingy and not supporting a festival properly, the remedy was to bring them to court, and the two people, the person who thought the other person was being stingy and the person who was accused of being stingy, would be given the opportunity to switch fortunes on the idea that if you really were being stingy, you wouldn't be willing to swap money with the other guy who had less money than you. I don't know that that's true, but that's a story they tell. So it's the right amount. It's not doing it at all. It's the right amount. All of our urges have their place. All of our appetites have to be fed to some extent or another. The question is, how much? Well, at least for most of us, the question is how much. Now, Aristotle acknowledged a special class. He calls it Megalopsychos, the great-souled one. Megalo, that's the biggest. That's bigger than mega. It's megalo. And then psychos for psyche, soul, and then os for identifying a person. The great-souled one, says Aristotle, has so much of an appetite and so great a collection of talents that for them to hold back in any way, shape, or form would be entirely wrong. Now, in doing this, of course, he's sanctioning the excesses of genius, that we should not tell Praxiteles only get to be so good at making statues. We should not tell Euripides, stop writing so well, tone it down. Of course, who he's really thinking of is that giant of Megalopsychoi. See what I did there? Alexander. Not everyone knows, but Alexander was tutored as a child and right on into his teens and accompanied right on into his adulthood by Aristotle. Aristotle was a great influence on Alexander. For years, Alexander sent back samples and stories and specimens to Aristotle back home in Athens as his armies conquered the world. And Aristotle didn't want to be on the spot to tell Alexander, oh, you're going too far. I'm sure he did when Alexander was a young man and he was supposed to be the teacher, and it probably didn't fly too well. And so as he became Lord of all he surveyed, quite literally, Aristotle had to find a new peg to put Alexander in rather than condemn him. So at least this is my belief, and I'm not the only one. So he coins this Megalopsychos concept so that he can say, all right, now there are people who appear to be going way beyond the norm, but that's because they have so much. They have such great urges. They have such great talent. however you look at it, it's an excuse for Alexander to do whatever he wants and be excused by his tutor. We might take a moment here to reflect on the political nature of Aristotle's thinking. And I don't mean here his work in political philosophy, which is extremely influential even today, but rather his sense of politics. If he really did coin Megalopsychos to excuse Alexander, it won't be the only time he ever thought about politics in his philosophical career. The story goes that once Alexander died and word got back to Athens, there were people who wanted to take out Aristotle. He was, after all, tutor and friend to Alexander, who had oppressed Athens, at least in their opinion, for several years now. When word got to Aristotle, he immediately packed up and left town, saying he wanted to keep Athens from sinning twice against philosophy, referring, of course, back to their execution of Socrates. Now, to be fair, I doubt very much that was accurate. There are other previous philosophers to Socrates who were at least banished, if not executed, for their beliefs. And that was certainly as great a sin against philosophy as executing Socrates. And Aristotle was the first great historian of philosophy, so we can be confident that he knew about these banishments. But it is also important to remember that Aristotle's whole program here of teaching us ethics is practical. He is a practical man with practical thoughts. And being a practical man, Aristotle's aware that finding that middle course between the extremes in our passions and our appetites isn't all that easy. Sometimes it can be very difficult indeed. So he does offer us 3 guidelines to try to help us through the hard or harder passages. 1, you have to aim for the middle. So if you've got 2 extremes that you must choose between, choose the one that's less extreme. In other words, if you're going to go between eating all the food that's at the party or not eating anything at the party, it's better to not eat anything, because if we ate everything, we will not only have been a glutton, we'll have been rude, we'll have been a bad guest, lots of things. So the least worst, even though both are strictly speaking wrong. You're at the party, you're supposed to be one of the participants, which means you eat. But if if all you can do is go to the extremes, that's the one to go to. Going back to our adventures with our drowning victim, if all I can do to keep from freezing is to charge into the ocean and try to save them, Aristotle would say, do that. To stand and let somebody else die is a very bad thing. To try valiantly and perhaps fail, no one will fault you for. So keep that in mind. If you must go to an extreme, choose the one that's least worst of the 2. We know we have our own unique weaknesses. Whatever those weaknesses may be, there are just some things we're drawn toward. And in those weaknesses, we must be especially careful. So don't even, rely on habit, I suppose, but be especially reflective on those occasions where you're appealed to by a pleasure, by a passion that it's awfully easy for you to give into, or contrariwise, awfully easy for you to ignore. Find that passion and analyze it in that moment. In that moment, see if that appetite is something you should go this way or that way with. Okay? Don't rely entirely on habit where that kind of challenge is presented. And the last piece of advice he has to do with pleasure. When the excesses the two extremes that we're trying to find that middle ground between. If one excess drags us closer to having more pleasure than the other, try to avoid the pleasure, if only because pleasure leads on to further excess. As a general rule, abstinence does not. Pain stops us entirely from going in a direction. So, okay, here is practical rules. 1, do your best to choose the lesser of two extremes if all you can do is choose between extremes. The one that takes you furthest away from the mean to be avoided. 2, know your own weaknesses so that when the temptations come to go to extremes of any sort, pick the extreme that is less a problem for you. Stay away from your vulnerabilities, lean toward your strengths. And lastly, everybody's vulnerable to pleasure. So beware of situations where you're going to commit a vice that leads to pleasure, because pleasure leads to more pleasure and therefore more vice. As we see, the Nicomachean Ethics provides us with a system by which we can inculcate habits to get us through our whole life, making us a better person, a better citizen, a better parent, a better child, a better friend, and always a better person, because we are sticking to our strength, to our point of focus between the extreme places of vice, staying in the middle, doing what we do best. It permits us a personal ethic without being in any way relativistic. There is a goal that everyone seeks. It's just a slightly different goal for all of us. To say it's relativistic is to say that a map is relativistic. I can use the map to get from one place to another. You use the map to get from a place to a third place. But the map is the map. We're all going to go where we're going to go. And that's how it is with the Nicomachean Ethics. He provides us with a map to get where we need to go, even though we may be going in slightly different directions in slightly different ways. He gives us, therefore, a ground to forgive ourselves. As long as we're making the effort, that's enough. As long as it's an honest effort. When we fail, we don't ask ourselves, have I failed? We ask ourselves, is this who I am? And if that's not who you are, if this was a failure that's rare or perhaps even a one-time thing, then you go, well, no, that's not me. That's just a mistake I made. And so I can continue on my normally good course of action, my real ethic, my habit of excellence, and everything's okay. Something to think about, huh? Something to talk about. Keep talking philosophy.